I was standing over the grill at Riverside Heritage Park in St. Louis, flipping burgers for what felt like the 50th time that afternoon, smoke clinging to my shirt and the smell of charcoal settling into my skin, when my wife's aunt, Linda Parker, decided to liven things up. About 50 members of the Parker family were scattered under the rented pavilion, paper plates balanced on their laps, kids running in loose circles around the picnic tables, coolers sweating in the August heat. It was loud in the comfortable, chaotic way big family gatherings always are, conversations overlapping, someone arguing about Cardinals baseball, someone else complaining about traffic on I-64. Then Aunt Linda, holding a plastic cup of white wine and smiling like she was about to start a game, raised her voice and said, "Be honest, has anyone here ever regretted getting married?" The laughter came instantly, thin and nervous at first, then louder as a few of Madison's cousins played along and raised their hands halfway, grinning at their spouses to show it was just a joke. I kept my eyes on the grill, but I felt it before I saw it. Madison, my wife of 6 years, lifted her hand high into the air without hesitation and laughed, bright and unapologetic. "Oh, absolutely," she said, her voice carrying easily across the pavilion. A couple of her cousins whooped. Someone clapped. It landed like a punch I had been bracing for without realizing it. It wasn't the first time she had done that. She had made the same joke at Christmas when her mom asked how married life was treating us. She had done it at her office holiday party when a coworker teased her about settling down young. She even did it at a friend's wedding last spring, right after the vows, when someone joked about the ball and chain. Every time, I forced a smile and pretended it didn't bother me. I told myself she didn't mean it, that it was just her sense of humor, that couples joke like that all the time. But every repetition chipped something small and quiet inside me. Standing there with a spatula in my hand, listening to the laughter ripple through her family again, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, only this time it didn't fade. The heat from the grill suddenly felt sharper, like it was pressing against my face. I turned slowly, wiping my hands on a towel, and looked at her. She was still smiling, her hand still raised, soaking in the reaction. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. The joke wasn't for me. Before I had fully decided to move, I stepped forward out from behind the grill. The conversation quieted a little, not completely, just enough for people to notice. I raised my own hand, higher than hers, and kept my voice steady, calm enough that it surprised even me. 6 regrets, I said, holding her gaze now that she had finally turned toward me. 1 solution. The words hung in the air heavier than the smoke. The laughter stopped almost instantly, like someone had cut the power to a speaker. A paper plate slipped from someone's hands and hit the table with a soft thud. I could hear the distant shriek of children at the playground beyond the pavilion and the faint hum of traffic from the nearby road, sounds that suddenly felt too loud in the silence between us. Madison's smile faltered first, then disappeared. Her hand lowered slowly as if she had just realized it was still raised. Aunt Linda blinked, wine glass paused halfway to her lips. A few relatives shifted in their seats, eyes darting between us, unsure whether this was still part of a joke or something else entirely. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't yelling either. I just stood there, hand still up for a second longer than necessary, letting the weight of what I had said settle over everyone. The pavilion, packed and noisy only moments before, had gone completely still. Madison forced out a laugh that sounded thin and strained, waving her hand like she could erase what had just happened. "He's kidding," she said quickly, glancing around at her relatives as if inviting them to laugh with her and smooth it over. I didn't smile, and I didn't lower my hand until the silence became impossible to ignore. That was when her father, Richard Parker, stood up from the picnic bench so abruptly that it scraped against the concrete floor of the pavilion. He had always carried himself like a man used to being listened to, shoulders squared, voice firm, and now he fixed that same authoritative stare on me. "Explain yourself," he said, not loudly, but with enough force that no one else dared to speak over him. So I did. I said that if Madison was going to keep publicly joking about regretting our marriage, then I was done pretending it didn't matter. I said that every time she raised her hand like that, every time she laughed about it in front of coworkers, friends, or family, it chipped away at something that was supposed to be private and protected between us. I told them I had tried to talk to her about it more times than I could count, in our kitchen late at night, in the car after parties, even sitting on the edge of our bed when I told her it embarrassed me and made me feel small. Each time, she rolled her eyes and told me I was too sensitive, that I needed to lighten up, that it was just a joke and everyone knew she didn't mean it. I looked directly at her as I said that if humiliation was acceptable as humor, then honesty was acceptable too. I told them that the one solution I mentioned was divorce. I didn't shout it. I didn't slam my fist on a table. I said it the same way someone might state a fact about the weather, calm and measured, because I had already said the word privately before and been dismissed there too. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Her aunt gasped so loudly it echoed. One of her cousins muttered, "What the hell," under his breath. Someone else told me to calm down, as if I had been the one laughing. Richard took a step toward me, his face flushing red, demanding to know how I could say something like that at a family reunion. A few relatives began talking all at once, voices overlapping in a messy wave of outrage and disbelief. The children, sensing the shift in energy, stopped running and stared from a distance. Through all of it, I stayed where I was, hands at my sides now, posture straight. I said I had tried to keep it private, that I had asked her not to make that joke anymore because it hurt me and made me question what she really thought about us. I said that when I told her it felt disrespectful, she accused me of being dramatic. I reminded them that she had just done it again, loudly and proudly, in front of 50 people. I told them that if she could casually suggest she regretted marrying me as entertainment, then I could calmly admit that I was starting to regret staying in a marriage where my feelings were a punchline. Madison's face had gone pale by then, her jaw tight, her eyes no longer amused but wide and furious. She kept saying I was overreacting, that I was trying to make a scene, that this was not the time or place. I told her that I agreed, that it wasn't the time or place, but she had chosen the time and place when she lifted her hand and laughed. I wasn't raising my voice, but I wasn't backing down either. For the first time since we had been married, I wasn't willing to swallow it to keep the peace. Once the shouting settled just enough for my voice to be heard again, I said that if we were going to pretend everything was a joke, then we might as well talk about what the joke had cost. I started with the first regret, and I made sure to keep my tone even because the facts were heavy enough on their own. I told them that 9 years ago, when Madison got accepted into her MBA program at a private university in Illinois, I took out a $42,000 personal loan in my name to make it happen. I explained that at the time we were newly married, living in a small apartment in St. Louis, counting every dollar, and she was terrified of turning down the opportunity. I said I believed in her completely, so I went to the bank alone, signed the paperwork alone, and carried the debt alone. Her mother looked confused and immediately said she thought scholarships had covered most of it. I nodded and said that was what Madison had told them. I clarified that there were small grants, yes, but they barely touched the tuition. The bulk of it was the loan I signed for, and for 9 years I made every single payment without missing one. I worked overtime when I had to. I skipped vacations. I drove the same aging sedan long after it should have been replaced. I told them that I never once held it over her head, never once used it as leverage in an argument, because I thought that was what partnership meant. I carried that financial weight quietly because I believed we were building something together. Madison opened her mouth to interrupt, but I kept going because this was the first time anyone in that pavilion was hearing it. I said regret number 2 came a few years after that, when I was offered a senior engineering position in Phoenix that would have increased my salary by $40,000 a year. It was a promotion I had worked toward for nearly a decade, a role with more responsibility, more growth, and financial breathing room that would have paid off that loan much faster. I told them I was ready to take it, ready to relocate, ready to start over in a new city if it meant advancing our future. Madison had refused to consider it. She said her networking in St. Louis was too important, that her professional connections were just beginning to solidify, that moving would set her back. I believed her. I told myself her career was just as important as mine, maybe even more important in that moment because she had just finished her MBA. So I turned the offer down. I shook hands with my manager, thanked him for the opportunity, and stayed exactly where I was because she said we needed stability. Then I reminded them that 2 years later she accepted a position that required weekly travel, sometimes 3 or 4 days at a time, flying to Chicago, Dallas, Denver, wherever her clients were. Suddenly, being rooted in St. Louis wasn't essential anymore. Suddenly, distance and disruption were acceptable if it advanced her career. The sacrifice, it seemed, had only ever been expected from me. I had stayed for her networking, turned down $40,000 a year for her stability, and watched her board planes every Monday morning while I stayed behind paying down a loan her parents believed scholarships had handled. I said those were the first 2 regrets, and they were not jokes. I said regret number 3 was quieter, less dramatic on the surface, but just as heavy. After Madison finished her MBA, I had planned to start my own master's degree in engineering management, something I had wanted since before we got married. I had already researched programs, mapped out timelines, even spoken to an advisor. When I brought it up, she told me, almost casually, that one of us had to be practical. She said her career was still in a critical growth phase and that we couldn't both take risks at the same time. She reminded me about the loan, about the need for stability, about how someone had to be the financial backbone while the other built their future. The implication was clear, and I accepted it without a fight. I postponed my plans for a year, which quietly became 2, then 3, then 5. Each time I mentioned revisiting the idea, there was always another reason to wait, another milestone in her career that required my steady income and flexible schedule. I became the reliable one, the predictable paycheck, the man who adjusted his ambitions so hers could expand. By the time I finally realized how much time had passed, my momentum was gone. The programs I had once been excited about felt distant. My own goals had slowly been reframed as selfish distractions. I stood there in that pavilion and admitted that I let myself believe supporting her meant indefinitely shelving myself. That was regret number 3. Regret number 4 was the one that shifted the air completely. I said his name clearly, without anger but without hesitation, Derek Hansen. A few relatives exchanged confused looks, but Madison's face drained of color before anyone else reacted. I explained that Derek was her coworker, the one she said understood her stress better than anyone, the one whose name popped up on her phone more and more often. I told them that one night, after weeks of distance and coldness from her, I saw over 500 messages between them. Not work messages. Not neutral updates. Messages about how trapped she felt, about how our marriage felt like a cage, about how she wondered what her life would look like if she had chosen differently. There were secret lunches she never mentioned, inside jokes I had never heard, long threads that ran past midnight. When I confronted her, she insisted it was not physical, that it was just emotional support, that I was overreacting again. She said nothing happened beyond words. I told her then, and I repeated it in front of her entire family, that it did not matter whether it had become physical. She had already stepped outside our marriage in every way that counted. She had given another man the vulnerability, the excitement, and the complaints about me that should have been addressed to my face. Richard looked like he had been hit by a truck. His expression went from anger to something hollow and stunned as he turned toward his daughter. Madison tried to interrupt, to downplay it, but I asked her directly if she had told Derek that our marriage felt like a cage. There was a long pause, long enough for everyone to feel it. Then she nodded once, barely perceptible but undeniable. She admitted it. In front of everyone. I told them I had forgiven her once. I stayed. I agreed to counseling. I convinced myself that emotional betrayal was a mistake we could survive if we both tried. I swallowed my pride and chose to rebuild. But standing there, listening to her joke about regretting our marriage yet again, I realized that forgiveness without change had turned into self-betrayal. That forgiveness, given freely and defended stubbornly, had become regret number 4. By the time I reached regret number 5, my voice had not risen, but it had hardened in a way I could feel in my chest. I said that last year Madison earned $210,000. I earned $98,000. I let that sit in the air for a second so no one could pretend they misheard it. Then I said that despite that difference, I paid the mortgage every single month. Not half. Not a proportional split. All of it. When I first brought it up, trying to have a calm conversation at our kitchen table, she told me her income was for growth and mine was for stability. She said her salary needed to be reinvested into opportunities, into networking events, into travel, into positioning herself for executive leadership. Mine, apparently, was reliable, steady, predictable, perfect for covering the fixed expenses that kept a roof over our heads. I explained that what that meant in practice was simple. I funded the life she enjoyed. I covered the mortgage, most of the utilities, the insurance. She covered dinners with clients, flights, conferences, professional memberships, and the kind of lifestyle branding that made her look successful on social media. Whenever I questioned the imbalance, she reframed it as long-term strategy, as if I was too short-sighted to understand that her income was an investment portfolio while mine was a safety net. I told them about the night she mocked my $20 a month gaming subscription. She laughed and said it was childish, that at our age I should not be wasting money on virtual entertainment. She said it in front of friends, the same light, joking tone she used about regretting marriage. That same month, she spent $500 on boutique fitness classes she barely attended because they were good for networking and part of her brand. I never once told her to cancel them. I never called them childish. I just quietly kept paying the mortgage. Regret number 6 was not about money alone but about how she spoke about me when I was not in the room. I found out through a mutual acquaintance that she had told coworkers I was holding her back. Holding her back because I had asked her, more than once, not to schedule client calls during dinner when we were both home. I had asked for one uninterrupted hour in the evening, just to sit across from each other without a headset in her ear or a laptop open between us. Apparently, that request became evidence that I did not understand ambition. Apparently, wanting dinner together meant I was an anchor tied to her ankle. When I said that part out loud, there was no shouting anymore. There was just a heavy, suffocating quiet. Richard had stopped looking at me and started staring at the ground somewhere near his shoes. When I finished explaining that I felt less like a husband and more like a dependable wallet with a pulse, he exhaled sharply, turned, and walked out of the pavilion without saying a word. No one tried to stop him. The reunion unraveled after that. Conversations broke into hushed clusters. A few relatives began gathering their things. The kids were ushered away. The smell of grilled food still lingered in the air, but no one was eating anymore. Madison stood a few feet from me, rigid and furious, yet unable to deny what I had laid out piece by piece. The pavilion that had been loud with laughter less than an hour earlier now felt hollow, like something had cracked straight down the center of it. That night I did not go back to our house. I drove without music, without calling anyone, without even fully feeling the weight of what had happened until I pulled into the parking lot of a budget hotel just off Highway 64. The neon sign flickered slightly, and the place smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and stale air conditioning, but it was quiet and anonymous, which was all I wanted. I checked in with a man who did not look up from his screen for more than a second, carried a single overnight bag to a room with thin curtains and a stiff mattress, and sat on the edge of the bed staring at my phone as it vibrated over and over again. By midnight there were more than 70 missed calls from Madison. There were texts layered between them, some angry, some panicked, some demanding I come home and stop being dramatic, others begging me to answer. I did not reply to any of them. I let the screen go dark and placed the phone face down on the nightstand. For the first time in years, I felt still. Not calm, not happy, but resolved. Monday morning I called a lawyer before I even checked out of the hotel. We lived in Missouri, an equitable distribution state, and I had already spent months quietly organizing documents after the emotional affair, telling myself it was precautionary. I had loan receipts from the bank for the $42,000 I borrowed for her MBA. I had statements showing 9 years of payments leaving my account. I had records of the mortgage transfers, spreadsheets I kept tracking household expenses, and screenshots of the messages between her and Derek where she described our marriage as a cage. I had text exchanges where I asked for counseling and she dismissed it as unnecessary because we were fine. Within weeks, the paperwork was filed. There was nothing dramatic about it. No shouting in a courtroom, no public spectacle beyond what had already happened. She was served at her office. I later learned it happened between meetings, in front of coworkers she had once told I was holding her back. She called me immediately after, her voice shaking, accusing me of trying to embarrass her professionally. I reminded her, calmly, that for years she had embarrassed me socially, publicly, casually, and called it humor. I told her I had tried to handle things privately until privacy became a place where my concerns went to die. She cried harder then. She said we could fix this. She said we could start therapy immediately. She promised she would change how she spoke about me, how we handled money, how we handled time. She said she had not realized how serious I was. I listened without interrupting, then told her that 10 months earlier I had asked for therapy after discovering the messages with Derek. I reminded her that I had sat across from her at our kitchen table and said we needed professional help if we were going to survive. She had laughed softly and said therapy was for couples who were actually in trouble, not for temporary rough patches. I told her that what she was hearing now was not anger but consequence. I had asked for repair when repair was possible. I had asked for respect when respect would have cost nothing. I had asked for partnership when I was still willing to wait. By the time she was ready to fight for us, I was no longer fighting to be heard. I was simply walking away, and this time I did not look back. 3 months after I filed, mediation finalized everything in a quiet conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown, just paperwork, signatures, and the steady voice of a mediator walking us through terms that felt clinical compared to the emotional wreckage that had led there. She kept the house, but she had to refinance it solely in her name. The equity calculations were straightforward. She agreed to repay me $28,000 toward the original loan I had taken for her MBA. It was not the full amount, but it was documented acknowledgement that it had existed and that I had carried it. There was no alimony. She earned far more than I did, and even her attorney did not argue that point for long. When I signed the final page, I did not feel triumph. I felt release. Afterward, I rented a modest one-bedroom apartment with beige walls and a small balcony that overlooked a parking lot. It was nothing impressive, but it was quiet and entirely mine. I bought second-hand furniture, set up a simple desk by the window, and enrolled in my master's program in aerospace systems, something I had postponed for 5 years while being practical. Sitting in that first graduate seminar, surrounded by people discussing propulsion models and systems integration, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. I felt like my life was moving forward in a direction I chose. The financial adjustment was real, but it was manageable. Without covering a mortgage that dwarfed my income, without funding a lifestyle designed around someone else's image, my $98,000 felt sufficient. I paid my bills, studied at night, and slept without waiting for the sound of a suitcase rolling across hardwood floors before dawn. The quiet in my apartment was not loneliness. It was peace. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I attended a professional tech conference in Nashville related to aerospace and systems engineering. It was the kind of event filled with lanyards, panel discussions, and networking receptions where everyone holds a drink while scanning name badges. I went because it aligned with my program and because I wanted to build something based on my own ambition for once. That was where I met Claire Donovan. She was 31, a project logistics manager for a defense contractor, and she introduced herself with a firm handshake and direct eye contact that did not feel performative. We started talking after a breakout session about supply chain vulnerabilities in aerospace manufacturing. She asked thoughtful questions, listened carefully, and did not interrupt to redirect the conversation back to herself. Later that evening, a group of us went to dinner, and we ended up sitting next to each other. She asked about my master's program and seemed genuinely interested in the details. When I mentioned I had just gone back to school after postponing it for years, she said that took discipline. There was no sarcasm in her tone, no subtle dismissal. At the end of the night, I picked up the check for our table because it was my suggestion to try that restaurant. Claire looked at me and said thank you, not automatically, not distractedly, but directly, as if the gesture mattered. The word landed differently than I expected. It was small, almost ordinary, yet it carried weight because it was sincere. Over the next 2 days of the conference, we kept running into each other at sessions and coffee stands, and every time she thanked me for something simple, for saving her a seat, for sending her a link to a paper we discussed, for listening when she vented about a delayed shipment, I felt the contrast without having to analyze it. Thank you hit harder than any apology my ex-wife ever gave, because it was not extracted after conflict or wrapped in defensiveness. It was given freely for basic consideration. Standing there in a crowded convention center in Nashville, badge clipped to my jacket, I realized how unfamiliar simple appreciation had become to me and how much lighter my life felt without having to fight to be respected. A year after that reunion at Riverside Heritage Park, my life looked nothing like it had under that pavilion. I had finished the first intensive stretch of my master's program with strong marks, expanded my responsibilities at work, and secured a promotion that brought my salary to $130,000 a year, a number that felt almost ironic considering I had once turned down a $40,000 raise to preserve a version of stability that never truly existed. This time, there was no one asking me to be practical for their sake, no one reframing my growth as selfish timing. The offer came, I evaluated it, and I accepted it without hesitation. The difference was not just financial. It was psychological. I no longer felt like my ambition required permission. I heard through mutual contacts that Madison's situation had shifted as well. The rumors about her emotional affair with Derek Hansen had circulated more widely than she anticipated after the divorce papers were served at her office. In industries built on reputation and trust, credibility matters, and once doubt settles in, it lingers. I was told she struggled to maintain the same authority she once carried so effortlessly. I did not celebrate that information. I simply recognized that actions ripple outward in ways we do not control. Her father, Richard, who once demanded I explain myself in front of 50 relatives, barely spoke to her now. That detail reached me quietly, not through gossip but through the kind of subdued family updates that travel without commentary. Consequences had settled in places I could not have predicted. We ran into each other once, about 11 months after the reunion, in the produce aisle of a grocery store in St. Louis. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening. I was comparing prices on apples when I heard my name spoken softly behind me. When I turned around, she looked smaller somehow, not physically diminished but stripped of the certainty she used to wear like armor. We stood there between stacked oranges and the hum of refrigerator units, two people who once shared a mortgage and a bed, now separated by choices that could not be undone. She apologized. Not defensively, not laughing, not minimizing. She said she had changed. She said she understood now how her jokes, her dismissals, her affair, and the imbalance in our marriage had eroded something fundamental. She said she had started therapy on her own and wished she had taken my request seriously when I first made it. I listened without interrupting. I did not feel anger standing there. I felt clarity. I told her that real change happens before consequences, not after them. Growth that begins only when comfort is lost is not transformation, it is reaction. I told her I hoped she truly had changed, for her own sake, but that understanding the damage after it is done does not rewind it. When I walked out of that store with a bag in my hand and the evening air cool against my face, I thought back to that question at the reunion, the one thrown casually into a crowd as entertainment. She once asked who regretted their marriage, laughing as she raised her hand high. In that moment, I raised mine higher than anyone, not out of spite, not out of performance, but out of recognition that staying silent had cost me more than speaking ever could. I do not regret raising my hand. Not for a second.